Good evening and welcome to The Journey Home. I'm Marcus Grodi, your host for this program. EWTN for many years has given me this great privilege of coming into your homes and allowing guests to share how the Holy Spirit has opened their hearts and minds to the beauty of our Lord Jesus Christ and His church. And our guest tonight, Phillip Frederick, we always say where a guest comes from, and he lists as his starting point probably what might be the biggest denomination in America. He calls himself a former non-practicing Protestant. And if we called that group non-practicing Christians, sadly, all of us know people that call themselves Protestant or Catholic or Christian, but are not practicing. They may not know their faith very well for whatever reason, and they're not really living it or experiencing the joy. And that might be a glimpse of our guest tonight, Phillip Frederick. Welcome to The Journey Home.
Thank you,
Phillip.
Marcus.
It's good to have you here.
A pleasure to be here.
I mean, I always find it fascinating. You were talking a little bit, just a moment we had before the program, how journeys are different from one to the other. Mm-hmm. But it's still, after all these years, it amazes me to see the same fingerprints of our Lord Jesus Christ on people's lives. And what that tells us, even as the audience listens, I know we have people that watch the program, and part of the reason they watch is because they have members of their family that are non-practicing.
Indeed.
And so maybe the question is, boy, how'd you come back to the church? Maybe it'll help our children. So, Phillip, it's good to have you in the show. So I'll get out of the way as soon as I can and invite you to start from the beginning.
Okay. Well, starting from the beginning as a child, I had a wonderful childhood. I'm one of 4 children. My mom and dad they hail from southern Kentucky. And I think as in their lives, they were handled, the church they were in, I think it was kind of fundamentalist. And I don't think they felt a whole lot of love in that church. I think that the church kind of scared them. So by the time they became young adults, they decided to stay away from that. And my dad, he was in the Air Force. So he was in the Air Force as a jet engine mechanic. And I think he got all into this NASA thing where technology and being brilliant and whatever else. So I think his confidence in himself and his ability to do things grew. And he started to work for General Electric. And if you've ever, the test cells there are like NASA. So, you've got the closed circuit TVs and countdown timers and displays. So I think he really got wrapped up into that. Yeah. And
I've wondered, that kind of environment could breed that kind of real self-confidence or call to be extremely self-confident, self-focused even.
And that is the way he was. And it had an influence on the rest of the family because I personally, I should probably speak more about myself, I idolized my dad. I always tell people that whenever we would hunt mushrooms in the spring, and so when you'd go wading into the woods, I would follow Dad, and I would make sure that my foot fell in his footprints, and I just wanted to be just like him, and so he was, in essence, he kind of took the place of God in my life, and I had love for my mom and my dad, love and supreme confidence that they would never steer me wrong. And so we had a very happy childhood. We never, however, went to church as a family. It's an odd thing. But when we started going to school, public schools, people would occasionally start to witness to me, and when they would find out that I hadn't gone to church, or that I don't go to church. And I was always a little uncomfortable with, well, why don't I, and whatever else. And
did that question ever come up at home? Hey, Dad, why don't we do this? Or did your parents give any explanation?
No, not really. I mean, we had things. I think I can remember having, we got a yearbook encyclopedia, and with that came a couple books on the Bible. And I can remember reading the children's Bibles, and I can remember reading them, but they just, I had no basis. I had no help.
Growing up in America, I assumed that the usual religious holidays were celebrated.
Oh, yeah.
They just didn't have the religious cant to it.
Yeah. Well, you know, we did. We celebrated Christmas and Easter. I mean, they were big holidays. Thanksgiving. I can remember dressing up for Easter, putting a blazer on and a little bow tie, and standing out in front of Mom's tulip bed with our Easter baskets, and they would take our picture. And after that, it's okay, go in and change your clothes and go play. And there was no going to church that day. And so that was, you know, as I got older, I realized that was a little strange. But, you know, again, in defense of Mom and Dad, they really were, I believe they were handled roughly in their youth as far as religion goes.
But you also give the great example of you trust your parents.
Yeah.
You know, they were there, you know, the model they're setting for you. There's no reason to doubt it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you're good people, and also it was easy for you to just say, okay, this is truth. This is the direction.
Yeah. One time when I got older, we went to a family reunion, and I had an uncle, and this is on Mom's side, who was dying. I think he was dying of lung cancer, but he converted. He returned to his Protestant roots, and he offered a prayer before dinner. And after the prayer was over, I don't really understand why, but Dad mentioned to me that he believed that when you die, you basically get laid in a box and you get put under the earth and you decay, and that's the end. And I thought, well, okay, you know, Dad's probably right. I can see that. And so that's pretty much my philosophy on life, that there was no afterlife. Also, at about that time, I don't know if you remember, there was a book. It was Eric von Daniken's The Chariots of the Gods.
Yes.
Well, I read that, and I bought that stuff hook, line, and sinker. I really did.
I once gave a speech in college on how Jesus was the offspring of a space traveler and an earth woman, which was his idea. You know, basing on the wheels of Ezekiel.
Wheel within a wheel. Yeah. And
So, you know, that's...
Was your dad into that too, or was it just something you picked up on?
You know, that there was a television show, and I can remember him watching that with fascination. We sat down and watched it, and I don't know how much he bought into it, but as I was in my early teens, I really bought into it.
Wow.
And I went from that point, you know, pretty soon after that. By a couple years, I was in high school, and I had people that would come around and witness to me, and they were classmates, and they would come with their pastor, and they would sit there, and I know why they're there. They're trying to hit a hot button and to get
trying to save your soul.
Yeah,
of course,
and bless their hearts for doing that.
Right.
But the whole time I knew what they were doing, and it was just this subtle dance. They would try to box me in, and I could wriggle out. And when I eventually started working, I worked for an electronics company in Lebanon, and there were a couple guys that
Lebanon, Ohio.
Lebanon, Ohio, yes.
Right.
There were a couple of guys that I worked with that were evangelical Protestants, and they were trying to convert me. So we would get into debates. And we used to keep a little tote board up there, and it was the lions versus the Christians, and of course I was the lion. And they were debating me under unfair terms, because they debated from the position of faith, I debated from the position of fact, and facts trump faith in many situations because they can't prove what they're talking about. The only proof is through the eyes of faith, and if you don't have faith, there is no proof. So. But the tote board was always heavily in favor of the Lions as opposed to the Christians. And this one man, his name was Craig, said, "Man, Phil, if we could just get you on our side, I mean, you would do great." And I said, "Craig, it's never going to happen. You know, your faith is not going to trump my facts." And so that really is, as a young man, that's what I believed.
pretty soon after that, matter of fact, on graduation from high school, Mom and Dad did one great extravagance on me that I'll always be forever grateful. They paid for a senior class trip to the Bahamas, and for me to go. So I go there, and the first evening there, there's a party going on in the hotel. It was all these schools were there, and someone said, "Don't go down onto the west end of the hotel because those people down there are crazy." So my friend and I, of course, that's right where we went. And there was when we got down there, it wasn't nothing going on, but there was this beautiful blonde gal. She was wearing a print dress, and she was just spectacular, you know. And so I introduced myself to her, and she was Debbie Brown from Cincinnati, Ohio, and I introduced myself to her, and we went out a couple times while we were down there, and when it came time, because we arrived on at different times, they left like the day before I did, and I can remember being really frustrated that Debbie was leaving because I thought I wouldn't see her again. Now we were going to, she lived in Forest Park, so that's like 40-minute drive from Lebanon, and back in those days it was all long distance phone calls. So the odds of us, you know, seeing each other after that was slim and none. But we dated for a long time, and I can remember being impressed with her mother, Ruth Brown, because Ruth prayed the blessing before meals. I'd never experienced that. And Ruth kept, you know, the holidays, and she went to Mass. And it was my real first experience of being around Catholics and devout Catholics. And I went, as a matter of fact, Debbie used to go on search retreats. I don't know if they still offer those or not, but they're for young people. And my first Mass was escorting Ruth to pick up Debbie after a search retreat. And Ruth apologized to me about the standing up, the sitting down, the kneeling. And she said, just follow my lead, and you know, it takes about an hour. And I can remember thinking, the Mass is different because you don't have people, you know, the whole thing is very, it's just a peaceful thing, and I was impressed by that.
Our guest tonight is Phillip Frederick. Phillip, well, I'm back just a little bit more. Again, so even though you had no faith, had you been to worship as a Protestant?
No.
So you really hadn't even experienced worship?
No.
Generally. Had your parents ever talked about those Catholics over there?
No, you know, that's the one thing I'm thankful for to Mom and Dad. They didn't poison us at all toward any faith. There are people that would not like us because we're Catholic. But Mom and Dad never said anything bad at all about Catholicism.
So when you meet this Catholic girl, I mean, you're not a believer, but you're not bringing with it a slate of negativism to her faith. You just don't know it, never experienced it, can't even compare it to anything because you haven't. I mean, you were more than a non-practicing Protestant. You were hardly one at all, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there you were. So, and it is good. It's a blessing when you don't bring to it a bunch of negatives with it. How did she feel about your lack of faith, lack of interest, or was that a topic of a topic?
It was. I remember we had a little sit-down discussion at our YMCA in Lebanon, and she said, and we did this when it was apparent that our relationship was going to be long-term, and she just wanted to know. She was more concerned than anything with, does her Catholicism pose an issue to me? And I said, no. And she said, you know, what is your faith? And I said, I really don't have a faith. And I quickly changed the subject. You know, I didn't want to dwell on that. But no, Debbie's faith didn't bother me. Now, I will say that after we got married, and maybe I'm putting the cart before the horse, when she started going back to church, I warned her that those people they'll make themselves be a wedge between you and I. And that was a sincere concern of mine. So in that sense, that's my one prejudice against the church.
Okay, as it was happening. So,
Yeah.
But here you are dating. You're dating a Catholic girl. It seems like it's moving right along.
Yeah.
what was, by this time you're out of college yet at this point?
I didn't go to college. I did a couple years, but I really didn't complete college.
All right. But, I mean, are you working now? Because you ended up working where your father worked, right?
Well, I did. I started out working at this electronics company in South Lebanon. And it was, I guess I need to get things in sequence here. I worked there, and Debbie and I were married. We got married in 1981. It was in May, May 23rd. Anyway, so we were having a happy little life together.
I'm sorry, was it a religious wedding?
It was a Catholic Mass.
Okay.
Communion wasn't offered, but it was a Catholic Mass. And I can remember taking the pre-Cana classes. And one of the funny little lines was the person offering the class said, well, how many mixed marriages do we have here? And I'm looking around, and Debbie's sitting to my left, and she's got her hand up, and I'm like, when they said mixed marriage, I thought they were talking race, and they were talking faith. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, I can see that. So it was kind of humorous, but anyway, I can remember when you signed the piece of paper saying that you won't preclude your children from being Catholic. I can remember thinking cleverly, well, but I won't encourage the children to be Catholic either. So I thought I was clever. I wasn't. Anyway, Father Dave Lemkel married us. He was a very good man. We were married at Our Lady of the Rosary, oddly enough, in Forest Park, Ohio. I say oddly enough because we are a rosary praying family now. We love the rosary. Anyway, so we were married, and we had a nice little life together. Debbie and I, like a lot of young couple, were trying to figure ourselves out. Sometime in the spring, I think around 1983, I got a call from a close family friend who asked me with a halting voice if I had spoken with Mom and Dad, and I said no. And she said, you need to call your Mom and Dad. So I called him, and Mom was on the phone. I said, Mom, what's wrong? Ann said that there's something I need to talk to you about. And Mom starts sobbing into the phone. And I'm like, what is going on? And she told me that Dad had a mass in his abdomen, and they didn't know what it was. And I talked to Dad, and Dad said, yeah, we're going to go get some tests done. And the doctors pretty quickly diagnosed it as lymphoma. And they gave him chemotherapy, they did some testing on him to specify what it was. And they came home from the hospital on Mother's Day that year, which is painful for Mom. She'll always remember that on Mother's Day. And I still remember Mom in the kitchen crying pitifully, and Dad kind of sitting on the sofa in the living room, just kind of stoically telling us, yeah, this 6 to 10 year sentence is really all I have. And I can remember thinking, how does this jive with your faith and what you believe? But he just was very stoic about it. Anyway, we began then trying to present Mom and Dad with grandchildren right away. We were contracepting. And so our first daughter, Carolyn, was born. And then very quickly after that, Katie was born. And it was neat watching Mom and Dad be grandparents because they really took to it very well. There's a picture of Dad feeding the girls a little scoop of vanilla ice cream on a cone. It's just precious. Sitting on his lap on the back patio. And it's a shame that he was taken so soon from us. But toward the end, Dad started speaking. His family was from the Church of Christ. I can remember seeing his dog tag. He was in the Air Force. Seeing his dog tag, and it said Church of Christ. I was a boy, like 8 years old. I said, does this mean you're Catholic? And Dad says, no, it's Church of Christ. I said, but does it mean you could be Catholic? And he said, well, yeah, you could. I could. So I don't know why an 8-year-old who knows nothing about Catholicism would ask that. But anyway, he started speaking to this minister from the Church of Christ. And I don't have any idea what they talked about, but Dad had expressed the desire to be baptized. And the minister for that church said, we only do total body immersion. And I should have said before this, when Dad's cancer got very advanced is when this happened. And they had done they were going to remove his spleen because they saw through CAT scans, this is somewhere around 1988, they saw a dark mass in his abdomen. So they thought his spleen had kind of ruptured and that he was bleeding that way. And so they cut him, basically his whole abdomen open. And he was healing from it, and he had almost no immune system. So he told the man that he couldn't have total body immersion, that he'd get an infection and be dead very quickly. So I don't know what, I think the man's name was Steve, ever told him about that, but Dad was never baptized. The fall, October 15th of 1989 is when Dad passed away. He was 49 years old. And so from my perspective, my dad was my God. My God was now deceased. I had this fleeting thought that I would just do anything I wanted to do. I had no reason to be good. I had no reason to aspire to anyone's praise anymore. And I really don't know why I didn't go that way. The raising of Mom and Dad, being married to a good woman, I'm certain, contributed to that. But that's...
Yeah, but given your position, your perspective, that's a valid question.
Yeah. If you don't believe in anything, there's no reason,
Yeah.
So I lived for several years after that, learning to be my own man. I think that I particularly, being as dependent on my dad as I was, it kept me from growing up. And I started doing things for myself, thinking for myself a lot more than I had before. And I think that his death was the last step in my maturation as a man. And I started thinking at a point then about mortality. And it kind of bothered me a little bit that Dad had said, well, when you die, you just go in a casket and you decay, and then talking about being baptized. So he never really told me, but there's a slight disconnect. So, in the back of my mind, I'm thinking he had a revelation. There's something that changed in the way he thought. And I'd started, I had started drifting that direction toward thinking about spirituality. At an event that happened, Debbie's mom had a stroke. And we didn't at first understand what had happened to her. This is a few years after Dad passed away. And at one point, she was critically ill. The hospice had been called in. They were saying she won't last the night. Her fingernails had turned kind of purplish, and she was in an embryonic fetal position, I should say. And so we were all gathered around. Debbie's brother and sisters were all gathered around. And they said, well, let's pray a rosary for Mom, just to let her know we're here and to let her know it's okay to go on. And she hadn't spoken for a couple days. And so we're praying the rosary. And near the end of the rosary, Ruth opens her eyes, surveys the room, looks around, like, what are you all doing here? And I'm like, that's weird. So anyway, I leave that night. And Debbie...
Were you joining them in the rosary?
I was. But at that time, I'm like, yeah, I can do this stuff. I don't feel it, I don't believe it, but I can do this. And so I went home that night, and Debbie came home way early the next day, and I said, so is she gone? And she said, no, she's still here, but it's not going to be long. Anyway, about 11 o'clock toward noon that day, we got a call, and I'm like, well, this is the call. So Debbie's sister Barb called and said, Phil, yes, can I speak to Debbie? And I'm like, okay. So I called Debbie over there, and Debbie, it's going to be hard to say this. Debbie says, Mom? And it's her mom talking to her on the phone, just right as rain. And I'm like, that's very odd. How can you go from being at death's door to within 12 hours speaking to your daughter on the phone? And it is truly, if I can say that I've seen a miracle, it was that. And Ruthie got well enough to attend family Christmas that year. She died shortly after that. But that was a miracle recovery. And it was, I'm certain, so that she could say goodbye to all of her family. And Ruth, her role in my journey home was tremendous, and it's kind of we don't talk about it much. It's a little unacknowledged, but it was sincere and profound. Going with me to Mass, we would go to, by then, I'd go with Debbie and her mom to Easter Mass. And so anyway, that
I'm guessing, whether you know it for sure or not, that Ruth was certainly praying for her son-in-law.
Well, she was.
That his heart and mind would be open to the beauty of the church.
She, when we moved out of our apartment the first time, we broke the bed down. When we moved the mattress of the bed, we found a green scapular.
Of course.
And I didn't know what it was.
Well, I imagine a non-Catholic viewer is having a clue what we're talking about,
Yeah.
but that's one of the Catholic devotions of their means of offering up a sacramental, a prayer for the conversion of someone. It's not a superstitious little coin that you stick in there, but it's to be connected with a very committed offering up of prayer for that person, and she was doing that for you. Why don't we pause there, Phil?
Sure.
It's a good time for a break, because it sounds like you're getting at that point where you're going to start talking about this is what's starting to happen to open your heart to the church. All right, our guest for tonight is Phillip Frederick, and we'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to the Journey Home. Our guest tonight is Phillip Frederick. I'm Marcus Grodi, your host. I was thinking about you mouthing the rosary with the family. You can play along. You don't have to believe it and all that. But I think if you look back, were there seeds being planted in the act of doing that, both intellectually as well as spiritually, as you look back in your life at that time?
Yeah, I think so. I've called it nudges. I think a lot of people will call that their eventual journey to the church, that you've been nudged your whole life. And even going back to my dad's dog tags and my asking about being Catholic, there's no reason to do that. But the call, I think, has always been there for me. And there are just myriads of things, looking back on it, that have nudged me into that orbit. My daughters, so one of the things that happened when Debbie and I married is I drew Debbie away from the Catholic Church. She really didn't go. I mean, maybe the high holidays, but that was about it. So we're at a family gathering. It may have been a wedding, and Debbie's nephew's wife was talking to our oldest daughter and said, "So, are you ready for your first Holy Communion?" And Debbie's like, "We haven't done the classes. She hasn't done that yet." So that Sunday, Debbie shows up for church, and they have registration for PSR, Parish School of Religion. So Debbie enrolled her in these classes, and so Debbie started going in the fall back to church again. And that's when I warned her, you let those people drive a wedge between you and I in the church. And that was my experience. There are family members who had gone into other faiths, and it's like if the husband didn't follow, then they were going to drive a wedge between the husband and wife because they wanted her in the fold. So that was my concern. And Debbie would go off, and I would stay at home, and I'd fix breakfast, and she'd come home with the children. And that, perhaps that's another thing I should put in there. A year after my dad died, on October the 27th, our son Philip was born, who was born while we were contracepting. We were still far away from any of the church teachings. And what was so neat about that, I had a friend who, so I left working at the electronics company and I went to work for my dad's company, which was GE in Cincinnati. And there was a friend there, his name was John, we called him Trapper. And Trap was an evangelical Protestant. And he told me, he says, well, what would it take for you to come to church? And I said, what it would take would be for me to sit down, just like I'm talking to you, and talk to my dad. That's what it would take. And he said, well, that's not too tall of an order. Let me work on that. I'll pray for that. And so I started having dreams of my dad, and I dreamed he was still alive, and I could feel his presence. And when I would wake up, I would be confused right at the start, and then I would realize, that was a dream. But it was so real that I would cry because I felt like he was still there, and it was like losing him all over again. So I'm thinking of what Trapper had said, and I'm like, man, that's not exactly the deal, though, Trap. I wanted to be able to sit there and talk to him, but it was very, very close. And then, like I said, a year later, my son, who we named Philip Lester for my dad, is there. So it's almost like my dad reincarnated, and reincarnation is a bad word,
wrong word,
but he's back, you know, and so that's rattling around in my head. The other thing is when I started working for GE, I started in electronics. My background is electronics. I got laid off from GE, and GE went from 22,000 people in Evendale to 8,000. And wow. I wasn't going to get called back at GE, not in that job anyway. Well, the manager of the area called me back as an exempt employee working as a technician, which is exactly what my dad was doing, in the exact same building that my dad worked in. And it was weird because eventually they have job classifications, and I became the cell owner of test cell A1, which was the exact test cell that my dad was a cell owner in. So I was walking in my dad's shoes again. And you know, these things are rolling around in my mind. It's like the coincidence was remarkable. So all of those things, Ruth's miracle, her recovery, started really making me wonder. And Dad's deathbed conversion, if you will, started to make me wonder. So Debbie's going to Mass, and she's lugging the children off to Mass, and you know, 3 children can be a handful sometimes. So I thought, well, I can start going, and I'll just referee the kids. I'll keep the fighting to a minimum, and she can enjoy Mass. So I'm sitting there, and Father Lou Holmeyer was our pastor at the time. And Father Lou is a saintly man. His homilies, they just exuded holiness. And I'm sitting there listening to him, thinking, I could get used to this. This is very comforting, very soothing. I feel this love for Christ that I'd never felt before. And I didn't know what was going on there. And I can remember one Sunday we were up late or something like that, and Debbie decided to let me sleep in. I think I worked late. And Debbie decided to let me sleep in that day. So I'm hearing them out in the rest of the house getting ready to go out the door. And I leap out of bed. I'm like, why didn't you wake me? And Debbie says, why? I thought you'd like to sleep in. I'm like, I'm going to Mass. So I throw my clothes on, mat my hair down, and go off to Mass. And Debbie, to this day, she really didn't know that I had fallen in love with a Mass and fallen in love with, Father Lou and his teaching. So Father Lou at this time was starting to get somewhat elderly. He had bad health. He started offering communion. He would sit on a stool because it hurt his back to stand that long. There were rumors that he was going to retire. And I'm like, I really need to make up my mind what I believe, because if he retires and then I get baptized, I couldn't live with myself not having this man baptize me. So that fall, an announcement shows up in the bulletin about RCIA, Rite of Christian Initiation for Adults. And I told Debbie I want to sign up for that. And she says, but you're taking college classes at night. And I know, but but I want to join the church. And the classes, I can finish those anytime, but I really want to go through RCIA. So she treated me like I was glass, or like I was, some frightened animal that I could get scared away. But there was no turning back at that point. I loved the church. I started reading about the church, because the only thing that bothered me was, is it the right church? And so I started researching all the various different denominations outside of the Catholic Church. And they all kept pointing back to the Reformation, or some of them didn't even make it that far back. And I'm like, it became more and more apparent to me. The longer I sought the truth, it became more apparent that the church that Christ founded was the Catholic Church. So I'm like, this has got to be the place. So I show up for the first night for RCIA, was offered in the rectory. There was only like 3 or 4 people in the class that I was in. And Father Lou, he leaned back, he took his collar off and was just very relaxed. And he started working through the sacraments. The first sacrament that he worked on was the Sacrament of Baptism. And he says there's 3 forms of baptism in the Catholic Church. There's the baptism by faith, there's the baptism by blood, and there's the baptism by desire. And I said, can you explain the baptism by desire? He said, well, Phil, if you want to be baptized, but there's some obstacle, something that cannot permit you to be baptized, then you're considered baptized in the Catholic faith. And I'm like, oh, that's my dad's way in. And it's like, I was so thrilled. I couldn't restrain myself. I come home and I'm telling Debbie about it. And my dad and I shared a barber. His name is Wendell. And Wendell is a very good man. He's a Protestant man. And I was telling him about this. And he says, well, Phil, that's scriptural. I'm like, how so? He says, well, the good thief on the cross. He probably wasn't baptized, but he was assured that before that day was out, he would be in paradise with the Lord. I'm like, you're right. That is scriptural. So I was just thrilled that not only was I going to be in the church, but my dad was going to be in heaven waiting for me. And that was, the whole thing. When you realize that you're going to be where your wife is, you're going to be where your children will eventually end up being. It was the relief, I guess I really don't know how to exactly to describe it to you, how I felt, but it was tremendous.
Again, our guest is Phillip Frederick tonight. Do you remember in that journey, 'cause the Lord's been using in your life then all different kinds of ways to give you a glimpse that there's another world? Mm-hmm. And from your earthly perspective, are they coincidence or reincarnation or however you're going to describe? But the point was that the Holy Spirit was nudging you, as you said, to be awakened to that there's another dimension here. Do you remember at what point you talk about you falling in love with the Mass, you're falling in love with the teaching of Father, was it Leo?
Father Lou.
Father Lou. At what point did you fall in love with our Lord Jesus?
That's the interesting thing about that is for me it was learning that God existed. Falling in love with Jesus, a lot of the times when people would witness to me, they kept pushing Jesus. And I ran away from that. I didn't even use the name Jesus for a long time. And I really do think it was when I recognized the Lord in the Eucharist. One of the things that Father Lou talked about when we talked about the sacraments and we talked about the Eucharist was that the Lord was in the Eucharist. And that was wonderful. But I think probably my biggest conversion, we went to Christ Renews His Parish, a local parish retreat. And in that is where I really fell in love with Jesus and felt that Jesus loved me much more than I could possibly imagine. And so from that point on, I've grown out of that.
I could imagine that experience with Christ Renews His Parish, which is a Catholic weekend renewal, might have brought it all together for you. Mm-hmm. I could imagine how that would have done that. Yeah. That very powerful experience of our Lord. in the context of other Catholics renewing their faith.
Yeah. But it's, the strange thing is when you go from, I've always said, and I'm sure you've heard it before, there was no proof that God existed, but there was a day, and I don't know when it happened, when I allowed myself to just open myself to the possibility that yes, in fact, God did exist. I saw it daily. I saw things that told me that He existed, that He loved me, that He cared about me, that He was guiding my life and guiding events in my life. And looking back on Ruth's, miraculous healing, my son being born, you just start seeing things that there's just no way that was an accident or a coincidence, that it was a signal grace, a sign from God that yes, I'm here, I'm in charge, you need to follow, you need to learn.
When you were mentioning earlier about your dad's desire for baptism, it didn't happen. I was about ready to say baptism desire, and I didn't.
Yeah.
To discover, I almost get teary-eyed myself.
Yeah.
To discover them, that was a touch of the Spirit.
Yeah.
Not only for him, but for you.
Yeah.
And seeing that, is your wife doing backflips that you've come into the church?
She somewhat guiltily will say that she never prayed for my conversion. When her sister Barb, who lives in California, and Barb is the family zealot, and when Barb found out I was taking RCIA class, she sent me 3 books, 2 of them. One of them was a catechism, and the other one was Surprised by Truth. And I, for some reason, can't remember the third one right now. But Barb told Debbie that she was praying for my conversion and had prayed for my conversion all along. One of Debbie's friends said that at our wedding he was talking to Ruth and saying, well, what about Phil not being Catholic? And Ruth leaned over to him and she said, Debbie will get him in. So, it's that people are always praying for you. When I was taking RCIA class, Father Lou, Deacon Ned Ostendorf, Herschel Stewart, Deacon Herschel, told us that people were praying for us all the time in parts of the world that you can't imagine. Yeah. And you start to feel that. You really do feel this pull. Earlier I was talking about in physics, when you cross the gravity boundary toward a black hole, you cross the event horizon. And at that point, there's no escaping the black hole. And it sounds unflattering to talk about God and the Catholic Church as the black hole, but once I crossed that, there was no getting out, and I'm thrilled. Yeah. I might be the happiest man ever being in the faith. I love the faith. Yeah. The thing that is frustrating about now being in the church and knowing so many people that are outside the church, having family members that are outside the church, I want to witness to them just as my evangelical friends tried to witness to me. And when I start talking to them, I see the eyes glaze over, and I'm like, oh, please just give me a minute. Listen to me for a minute, because it's so warm and cozy by the Catholic Church, in the Catholic Church, like a little fire, It's just beautiful.
Comparing Father Lou's approach versus, you mentioned others that were trying to press all the time. I mean, there's the presence of the Eucharist, there's the Mass, but then there's also Father Lou's approach. I wonder if you look back on that and see that there's something we can learn from how Father Lou brought the gospel to you that gives us encouragement to reaching out to others.
Yeah, he really embodied the love of his fellow man. Father, he just loved everyone, and when you were around him, he's got in the parish. He's been gone several years now, but he's still got a large following of people that absolutely adore Father Lou, and it's a healthy following. They love him, and they pray for him, and they want to know how he is. My second child, Katie, a few years ago, we had a healing mass, or not a healing mass, but a confession mass.
Oh, yeah, right.
And this is after Father had retired. He came back to hear confessions for this mass, and Katie didn't know he was there, And when the priests all processed in, she saw Father Lou, and she just burst into tears. Yeah. And it's just the love that she had for Father.
So it isn't just the words, though they're true as they are, but with Father Lou, they're particularly backed up by the love of him as a person.
The way
it characterized
the way he lived the gospel. Father definitely lived the gospel.
Now, since coming into the church, you said you're a rosary praying family.
Yeah.
Well, how has the becoming a Catholic changed you and your family?
Yeah, and my girls and my son probably less, remember the days before my conversion and my days after. So we went from sleeping in on Sundays and doing nothing to always going to Mass, to praying the rosary. We are a part of a family rosary group. We get together Sunday evenings and pray the rosary with several other families. We always went to that. We have a friend, still remember, it was after I converted, we were sitting around a local swimming pool, and he said, "Hey, the rosary's over at our house tonight. You guys want to come over and pray it?" And Debbie looks at me like, "Can we?" And I'm like, "Sure, yeah, that's fine." So we go over there, and we've just been praying the rosary since then.
All right. We have an email from Patsy from Tampa, Florida. She says, "Our home has not been a particularly religious one over the years. My husband and I are trying to remedy that, though. We were both raised cultural Catholics, but without much in the way of an active faith life. What are some things we can work on to bring our marriage and our kids closer to God?"
You know, for Debbie and I, going on faith retreats, you know, to help. We both did a Curcio weekend. Mm-hmm. Debbie was like hit by a lightning bolt on the Curcio weekend. And when you have experienced something like that, your faith becomes on fire. And then praying together, praying the rosary in the evenings together really does help an awful lot. Making sure that you keep bad influences out of the house helps an awful lot. Our house, when you walk into our house, there's no doubt that you're in a Catholic home. There are crucifixes over the doors. There are devotional statues through the house. You just have to start living the life.
How do you explain those to your non-Catholic buddies when they stop over?
You know, they really don't say anything. I think I really don't know what their take on it is. I hope they just see it as piety, that they see it as goodness, and that we're trying to display that. You know, we've got the little Mary statue out front, Mary and the infant in Prague holding the baby Jesus. So that's what we do.
Do you see Father Lou as now a continuing model for you?
He is. Father comes to the parish every now and again to visit us. We just dedicated a new church. Father worked long and hard to try to get the new church going. He saved some stained glass windows for us. And when he came into town, I was Father's valet, and there was no higher position. I was very proud to do that.
We have another email, Kathleen from Oregon. She writes, "I am a lifelong Catholic, and I love my church and all it stands for. Protestant churches are good at reaching out to anyone who comes into their church and makes them feel very welcome. We in the Catholic Church here are friendly, but there isn't a lot of connection to make our parishioners and newcomers feel that they really belong. Are there any workshops, books, or anything out there that could help change this?"
Again, in our parish, the Christ Renews His parish, once you go on that weekend, you've got hundreds of friends, because the closings, the whole program, you really do get very integrated in the parish. We do things, we have outreaches in the community. We have St. Vincent de Paul that we go to people's house and we help them spiritually and with material matters. I'm a member of the Knight of Columbus, and we do outreach there. We try to help people that need things fixed, furnitures moved, things of that nature. So yeah, it's unending in the church, the things that we can get involved in the parish and in the community at large.
Thinking about you walking in your dad's footprints.
Yeah.
Your dad did the exact same job you are doing, or we're doing.
We're doing, yes.
But he did it without a sense that there's anything after this life, which to me, I can't imagine that because I've never lived that way. I've always, even in my wild years, believed somehow, even when I was in the Van Daniken days, I think in the back of my mind. Because the lack of anything after the box just would seem to undercut every reason for doing anything. But now you're in the very shoes, very job, or we're in the very job. How did your conversion of faith change your attitude towards work and who you are as a man and what you're doing? Did it have an influence on that?
Yeah, it absolutely did. But because before I was working for myself, I was working for my family, and I pray the rosary usually on my drive in the morning. And one of my prayer intentions is that I can do my job worthily as a disciple of Christ, and that I can somehow influence others. So you start to live a larger life when you're living for someone other than yourself. You're living for Christ and His church. And that's something that makes what Dad did, in my estimation, even more wonderful, because he lived under such a limited definition of a life scope. And if he had had a church, that he could work within, it would have been a lot better.
Well, even the way you told your story is an indication that you began to see life differently, because you're looking back and seeing how God worked here, or God worked there, or God did this. You're seeing that in a way that otherwise you wouldn't even have thought to do that.
No. One of the things that it dawned on me at some point, again, if my dad was my hero, and Dad could do anything, when his demise was manifest to him, when he knew he was going to die, and he decided he needed to convert, one of my big motivators was, I'm not as good a man as my dad was. So if I'm fortunate enough to see the end coming, can I do any less than my dad did? And that's the thing that I would tell everyone out there, is I don't care how supremely confident you are in yourself. My dad was very confident in himself. In the end, he knew he needed help. So.
All right. Dale from Columbia writes, I became Catholic along with my wife a few years ago. It was more her idea than mine, and I've never been too comfortable in the Catholic Church. I'd rather go back to my evangelical roots, but don't want to leave my wife behind. Is there something I can do to be a better Catholic?
I've always said, my big thing is this: look for the truth. If you really need to know what's right, seek the truth. Study. What does Catholicism teach? And these other churches, where did they come from? And you'll find they came from the Catholic Church. And why did they leave? And they left, this is not going to be politically correct, but they left out of disobedience. And that's never good. One of the things that it weighs on me is Martin Luther was a disobedient priest. And from that, Christendom used to be the Catholic world. But from Martin Luther and his disobedience, the church is fragmented and fragmented and fragmented. I have a friend that I work with who says, well, I really don't go to church anymore. I think I can just stay home and pray. I pray every day. And I'm like, you can't do that. That's not the rules. You've taken Martin Luther's disobedience down to the person level. And the whole world could be that way. And if the whole world does that, there is no church anymore. So we're going the wrong direction. Away from the church, the Catholic Church is the wrong direction.
1 minute to go. What about Our Lady?
I love the Blessed Virgin. I love her. And again, in my family, my Protestant background, they don't understand our mother. They don't understand. They don't understand the communion of saints. They don't understand that when these saints, when Mary died or ascended into heaven, was assumed into heaven, they don't understand that she's not separate from us. That our souls continue to live, and to know that she's there pulling for us as her children, speaking to her Son asking, his favors and his love for us is just a tremendous blessing.
Yeah, and besides their intercession, the reality of this great communion of saints also reminds us that we're still close to our dads.
Yeah.
I mean, what a blessing that is.
It is a tremendous
Philip,
blessing.
thank you for joining us on
My
the journey
pleasure,
home and
Marcus.
sharing your journey with us.
It's my pleasure.
And thank you for joining us on this episode of The Journey Home. I pray that it was an encouragement to you. God bless you. See you next week.